This site is supposed to look at the revolution from a common perspective, like Hudson's film was supposed to do. The first thing we're going to look at is material culture, physical things in the film, and we're going to start by looking at the use of clothing in this historical movie. So clothing is one of the more constant, evident forms of material culture, really, in any historical film. As a matter of fact, Hugh Hudson, in a 2009 interview, looking back at the production and critical reception of Revolution, he mentioned this. He said that one of the bigger criticisms of the film is people didn't like seeing Al Pacino, a modern gangster sort of actor, in period clothing. That really threw people off, just as an instance of how perceptible and important this is. This is from an interview quoted in scriptnews.com. Now, Hudson said, "They were used to seeing Pacino as a cop or gangster in a modern-day setting. They didn't like people stepping out of their mold. It's not fair because Pacino is a wonderful actor, and I think he gives a great performance." So the portrayal of clothing in Revolution is deeply problematic. While costuming might just seem like an aesthetic side note when examining a film's ability to accurately portray the past, costumes actually convey a lot of information, or most of the time misinformation, about history. So, for one example, this is sort of a false dichotomy created by the film's costuming. Everyone's clothing is either just over-the-top, ragged, and dull, and filthy, if they're, most of the characters are like this, or if there's a wealthy character, their clothing will be just ridiculously foppish and frilly, with a few exceptions. In reality, however, this class divide among clothing is at least not nearly as stark in the 18th century as it seems to be if you watch the film. And so this provides important context for understanding the actual revolution itself. You see, North America was part of a large global economy in an industrial age. So mass-produced textiles of many different varieties were typically available to most customers of almost all social standings, the exceptions being the very poor and the enslaved. So most people could have relatively large quantities of decently made clothing. Now, certainly while some urban poor individuals while working might have been clad in some ragged attire, and while of course many wealthier citizens of the colonies certainly engage in material extravagance, it's still greatly over-exaggerated in the film. So as an example of what a pretty average person might have, I'm going to list the items mentioned in an inventory of an actual indentured servant of what he brought from the British Isles to Virginia in the 1770s. Mr. John Harrower was his name. So Harrower brought one superfine brown cloth coat full mounted. So that's a very nice wool coat. One brown superfine broadcloth waistcoat, one flowered silk waistcoat, one fine Marseillais waistcoat, one brown duffel. The duffel's a heavy wool waistcoat. That's like a vest. One pair of black stockings and breeches, one new pair of doeskin breeches, one pair of flannel drawers, one pair of Osnaburg drawers, usually a type of linen, 6 ruffled shirts, 5 plain white shirts, 1 checked shirt, 1 blue cloth jacket, 7 muslin stocks, neck pieces, 1 black silk cravat, 1 pair of ribbed cotton stockings, 10 pair of worsted wool stockings, 1 new hat and 1 new wig, 5 pocket napkins, 2 hand towels, 2 pair of trousers, 1 pair of shoes. He notes that there are several other articles in addition to all these that were too mundane to mention in this inventory. So that's a lot of clothing for, again, an indentured servant. not a particularly high-class individual, and it's this industrial society that Britain and America is in that makes this possible. It's really just misleading to portray this sort of prototypical, very poorly clad society as Hudson does in Revolution. Also, brightly colored dyes were extremely common in England and the American colonies, again, often among people of quite a variety of different social standings. Of course, this is connected to the industrial complex of Great Britain, and professional dyers had really mastered the art of mass-producing brightly colored dyes that held to cloth well. So these dyes dyed clothing, dyes and furniture and all sorts of things really flooded almost every free household in the Atlantic world. So this is evidenced by lots of surviving objects, probate inventories, newspaper advertisements, and even in period art. This coat, for instance, which has New England provenance, but is actually owned by Colonial Williamsburg in Virginia, is a prime example of some of the many different types of colors available. Even sailors, who were definitely not particularly affluent members of colonial society, not known as such anyway, are depicted and described often as wearing very brightly colored clothing. So, the costume department, as another interesting note of Revolution, also employed plenty of sartorial stereotypes when with their very limited portrayals of Native Americans. So to add to the farcical old-timey times sort of atmosphere, it appears that the costume designer Hudson was working with simply borrowed outfits from a John Wayne Western movie, feathers, buckskins and all, to outfit these Eastern Huron Indian folks. So also, on the topic of fashion, I feel that it's important to mention that the heavy white makeup and absurd wigs and such worn by members of the McConaughey family, this really ridiculous costumes that they're wearing, it's really more reminiscent of deliberately exaggerated satirical dandy cartoons of the period than it is actual high fashion. So take a look at any well-dressed American or English gentleman or gentlewoman in the second half of the 18th century, and you'll note that while extravagance was certainly present, even in hairstyles, people rarely went to such extremes as to fashion a boat upon their noggin, even when trying to look their best from the portrait. But you can see, again, in satirical cartoon sort of drawings of the 18th century, they were exaggerating what they actually saw, making fun of people, and look, there's a boat. Maybe that's where they got it from, not sure, but that's quite unrealistic as well. So to wrap up, we're going to quickly examine a topic that's very prevalent in this film. However, it does kind of straddle the line between whether or not it's material culture. Nonetheless, it fits well into this discussion. That is the topic of hygiene. You'll notice that pretty much everyone, everywhere, all the time, except, of course, for our very pompous rich folks, are covered in dirt, powder, grease, even before battles start when they're soldiers. However, this, again, flies in the face of reality in the 18th century. So first off, in the military, leaders such as George Washington and Nathanael Greene constantly went to great lengths to regulate hygiene as a matter of discipline among their soldiers. Of course, in the civilian world, cleanliness was incredibly important in Georgian society, and this is again made pretty evident. Again, you have these mass-produced textiles. You can wear a garment just once at a time, change out garments, wash them. Visitors to North America note lots of washing is going on, and just one of many examples of the cultural importance of cleanliness in the 18th century. Here's an excerpt from a pretty typical piece of colonial legislation dating to about the middle of the century, outlining what was necessary in order for someone to obtain a license to operate a tavern, kind of like a hotel and restaurant in the 18th century. The tavern keeper must, quote, constantly find and provide in said ordinary good, wholesome, and cleanly lodging and diet for travelers. Now, just because I say that people truly value cleanliness in the 18th century, and that's not shown in the film, that's not to say that after a hard day's work or a battle, working and fighting men and women would not be filthy. Of course they would. But the problem in Revolution is that everyone, almost, again, excepting the very wealthy sort of characters, is covered in grime constantly. This was intentional, too. Hugh Hudson noted that in the film, he wanted to portray America's past as, to use his word, squalid. While there are certainly dirty, nasty aspects of every society, cleanliness was, as I mentioned, quite important during this era. So why does this matter? Well, first off, it's misleading about human nature. People prefer to be clean, even beyond this particular society, i.e. the Atlantic world in the 18th century, even beyond this society's cultural emphasis on being clean. I mean, just people prefer to not be completely dirty all the time, for the most part. So it's misleading about human nature. This is also important when you think about the medical context of the 18th century. Doctors knew that keeping clean was essential for combating the spread of disease. This was especially important in an age before we were able to treat as many infectious diseases as we can now. So, overall, the material culture, the world that's sort of created by revolution that's supposed to represent the 18th century simply doesn't. Its silly portrayals of the fabric of everyday life really just make it harder for viewers to take history seriously.